Thank you all for coming tonight and staying, being part of the tour and being part of this weekend. We could not be happier to have Hil Malatino kick off this final weekend of the exhibition and this fantastic symposium called Reckoning and Repair. We really, really encourage you to come back. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock, Sunday 1 to 4, there's going to be incredible conversations. Before Jennifer introduces Hil, I just want to also encourage you to buy books from Gender Fail, to look at the catalog, to go use the bathroom and look at Chris Vargas's work, just to soak up all this exhibition while you can. Come and say hi and talk to us and talk to each other. And thank you again for being here.
You have to forgive me, I'm a little starstruck because so many of the artists who are in the show are here tonight. And I'm just like, I'm kind of ecstatic. Yes. But also, I might get emotional even just talking about this, Hil, also because of El Palomar here. So I'm a child of queer theory. I got my PhD sometime in the 90s. I've had some wine. And, and I studied with a woman named Eve Sedgwick, who Nicki Green really reminds me of. You could be related to her. The subject, like so many of the things that we learned then are like here in this show, but so differently imagined through a trans and non-binary framework, which was not an organizing part of the discourse in which I was trained. And Hil Malatino's book, Queer Embodiment, it's not even an argument, it's a simple observation, right? That intersex people and intersex experiences are central and defining in queer theory, but also disavowed. I'm a product of that education. If you go to Eve's archives, you might find a drawing from me that actually is a visualization of an intersex person. Because when I came into graduate school, I was very fixated on the intersex body as like a kind of an imaginary space that was really important to me for an attachment. But I'd never given words to what that attachment meant and the possibilities that were kind of embedded in that attachment. It was Queer Embodiment, Hil's book, that really, it's like an excavation of the soul for me as a reader. Sorry, I had to write down the titles of Hil's books because I knew I would be a little. We're really happy to have Hil here, and Hil has an essay in the catalog, and it's gorgeously written. Hil's a really important writer, and also moves between like a kind of a personal and a theoretical voice very effortlessly. I think that Hil's a really important example for people who are trying to find a way to write, especially in this moment. Also, Hil has a kind of sports practice as a climber. And I just want to acknowledge that here because that's another point of like identification we've yet to even really dive into. I've mentioned Queer Embodiment, which is from, I can't believe how much you've published in just such a short period of time. It's nuts. This is Queer Embodiment, Monstrosity, Medical Violence, and Intersex Experience. And so you can hear just in the title how important that book is to the conceptualization of this show. That's from 2019. Side Affects on Being Trans and Feeling Bad from 2022. And Trans Care from 2020, which was a Lambda finalist and was awarded a Publishing Triangle Leslie Feinberg Award for trans and gender variant literature. Hil's a really important voice and really wonderful thinker, and it's been a pleasure to get to experience the way you write and think with art in particular. And I'm just going to turn the floor over to you, Hil. Thank you for being here today to kick off our symposium.
That was like the nicest, best, sweetest introduction I could have ever possibly imagined. Thank you for that.
I was afraid it was going to be creepy.
Oh, no! It made me feel like, you told everybody I was a climber too, which, so now people don't have to wonder about these forearms. Okay, so give me a second. All right. Can you all hear me okay? Got like the classic transmass problem of talking really softly and then not knowing how to hold a mic or stand close to it or whatever. So if I get quiet, just yell at me like I just did, like that. Just yell at me and I'll get closer to the mic. So I've been working on this talk today for the last 3 weeks. So it's probably not surprising to anybody in this room that like there's not a lot of art that shows up in it. Because every time I sat down to write about art, I was like, fuck! For obvious reasons. So the talk is called Heyday for Transsexual Paranoia. It's a fugue in 3 parts. I don't talk about why it's a fugue in the talk, and I maybe haven't figured out why it's a fugue yet, but I think it's a fugue. So I'll just get into it. The first part of the fugue is called I affirm the open mesh of possibilities, and all I got is this lousy police state. Oh, and actually, just a word. This image is from the NYU Langone protest from a couple of weeks ago, if you were just wondering about what the deal with that image is. And I included it because I think that it harkens back, of course, to AIDS protests, but also really importantly to a history of intersex activist protests at children's hospitals and at like pediatric conventions. So that's an important touchstone for me in my thinking, and also I think it's just important in this moment to think about all of the healthcare activism around trans youth care and probably soon trans adult care, and its significant roots in intersex medical protest, which too often get forgotten. Okay. This is also kind of a hard situation to navigate with the paper and the laptop and everything, so just bear with me. Cecilia Gentili, in her book Faltus, recounts a story about a neighborhood witch who cured her young self of a bellyache brought on by too many helpings of strawberries and cream. While administering the cure, the older woman leaned down and whispered in her ear, "I can make you a girl." Gentili writes, "For a long time, I dreamt of going back and accepting her proposition. I dreamt of falling asleep in her smelly bed to wake up the next day as a girl. What a dream." But she doesn't return to follow up on the offer. She, a skeptic, a realist, had learned from Disney movies that nothing magical came for free or lasted for long. I bought a copy of Faltus just after it came out, months before an accidental fentanyl overdose took Gentili's life. I picked it up finally on the last day of January, the day that New York City has declared Cecilia Gentili Day in recognition of her life's work for justice and long-term liberation for trans people, sex workers, immigrants. This was, at the federal level, a very bad fucking week for the communities Gentili labored on behalf of. ICE raids ramping up, mass deportation looming, Guantanamo being retrofitted for immigrants, the president of El Salvador offering up jail space, the Trump administration axing the ability to change gender markers on passports and social security cards, trans women being forced into men's prisons, executive orders promising to end federal funding for any schools promoting gender ideology or DEI initiatives, the CDC Nancy Drewing proposed research that uses any word that might be linked to wokeism. I could keep going, but my will is already flagging, and you already know about all of this. My insomnia kicked back into high gear during this week, and I stayed up for large chunks of the night spinning out increasingly apocalyptic scenarios and conjecturing endgames, each more dire than the last. At some point, just before waking, I had a dream that my dear friend Tim sent me a text that read, "Darling, they just appointed 2 more neo-Nazis to the cabinet. Did you see?" I woke up with a start and had that familiar feeling of relief when I realized I had been dreaming. But this quickly dissipated as I realized that the distance between waking life and nightmare has grown so slim that it's barely discernible. This overlap feels surreal. It's difficult to cognitively adapt to. This is, I suppose, what Steve Bannon means when he talks about muzzle velocity, a stunned silence as you struggle to adapt to the rapidly shifting contours of the political situation. This is not to say I wasn't prepared. I was, or at least I thought I was. Here's a quote from Eve Sedgwick that I'm sure some of you already know. The first imperative of paranoia is there must be no bad surprises. She goes on, paranoia requires that bad news be always already known. The last week of January forced me to admit that I am a paranoid reader of the world. I do not want to be. I've tried and tried to render myself attuned to the possibilities that inhere in the everyday, to be open to the emergence of the new, good, bad, or ambivalent. But I'm nevertheless there with Gentili, recoiling from her encounter with the neighborhood witch. You tell me something good is possible, I wait for the other shoe to drop. I refuse to get got. No bad surprises. Here's the thing. For years, I have imagined what might happen if the conservative playbook for regulating transness out of ostensible existence were to be successful. I've thought about what it would look like for gender-affirming care to be outlawed for both youth and adults, for communities to become deputized to snitch on caretakers of trans kids, for the government to refuse to process gender marker changes, for the most reductive and wrong definitions of biological sex to become legally enshrined and institutionally laminated. I've never once, for a moment, had an uncomplicated faith in a narrative of progress. I've instead thought, pessimistically, many times, there is no bottom to the horrors. I've sometimes considered this a personal disposition towards the negative, but I've also thought of it as a generational rift, the product of coming of age in the bad old days when transition was a bureaucratic nightmare, when casual transphobia was so deeply ensconced in popular culture, when trans people were so brutally and derisively abjected that we were, at best, a joke, when trans embodiment reliably solicited radically invasive forms of curiosity and speculation. This is living memory for many of us, a past that hasn't gone anywhere, a brutal tide that breaks over the shoals of trans lives again and again. I freeze in the face of discourse on trans joy, which is not to say that I have qualms with it, that I haven't experienced it, or worse, that I'm somehow against it. What kind of monster would that make me? The kind of monster I want to be. Other monsters are preferable. It's that the paranoia isn't easy to shake. And these past few weeks have been an awful reminder that the paranoia, as much as I might want to shake it, is, well, justified. Like Sedgwick says, paranoia knows some things well. As I'm working on this, I get a sweet email from a colleague in Sydney concerned about the current course of political events over here. She quotes me back to myself, a line from Trans Care that I wrote a few days after the first Trump administration attempted, according to the New York Times, to define transgender out of existence. Back then, in 2018, I wrote, "To be made juridically illegible is a form of erasure and exclusion, to be sure, but it's not as if it will stop actually existing." Now, I'm not so sure. Now, in paranoiac mode, I think that it depends on how we locate the locus of existence and how that locus becomes embattled and attenuated, rendered possible or impossible. This is a tricky business. A few days after that email, a friend told me about a graduate student who had recently changed their name and pronouns. Now, a few days into this administration, they were asking the professors to go back to using their birth name and assigned gender. What does it mean when someone reanimates a dead name, a former way of being known in the world, because it feels too unsafe to live into some other way of being? It's simply true that a softening of gatekeeping procedures, expanded insurance coverage, support for youth transition, and the cutting of red tape that made bureaucratic name and gender marker changes easier to come by has meant more people transitioning. This is something to celebrate, not lament. But it also raises questions. How many people will decide not to transition or not understand it as an option over the next few years, provided this administration has its way? They're betting that a removal of the material enablements, material enablements translates to the cessation of trans existence, or at least a decrease in numbers. I remind myself that DIY transition is always a possibility, that hormones are relatively cheap and widely available, at least for now. Technically and technologically speaking, they're a particular cat that's going to be very hard to put back in the bag. But in the calculus of drive to headache, it feels true that the headache will, for a lot of folks, counteract the drive. Floating down a creek with my friend Monica one day, she tells me that if it had been easier, she would have had top surgery when she was younger. She's in her early 50s now, and she says it's too late to bother. So this next section is called Technically People. Recently, I had the enormous privilege of workshopping an early draft of Talia Betcher's forthcoming book, Beyond Personhood, an essay in trans philosophy. This is like classic Talia. There are some words, behind her. The words are all really important to the book, but it's not quite clear, I think, on first glance what they're doing. So hopefully you'll understand it a little bit better after the next few paragraphs. In this book, she uses the phrase technologies of personhood to describe clothing, hormones, surgical procedures, wigs, and other sundry accoutrements that help one signify in the world, in relation, in the ways one desires. In past work, I have used the phrase technologies of transition to mark this ensemble, usually with a lengthy caveat that these technologies are not exclusively utilized by trans people. Non-trans people too have top surgery, take hormones, etc. all the time. But Talia makes a universalizing move. She skips all that and gets directly at the underlying point, which is that personhood is fundamentally reliant on all sorts of technologies, all sorts of extensions, all sorts of connections. Personhood is technical. Every person, to be a person in the multiple worlds in which they dwell, utilizes technologies of personhood. There's nothing uniquely trans about it, unless we're thinking of the various foreclosures, blockages, and punishments some of us encounter as we go about this very mundane, universal business. Indeed, it is in a description of such a situation that the phrase appears, when Talia is describing the routine denial of basic technologies of personhood, wigs, bras, hormones, to trans women in prison. While the phrase appears only briefly in the text, it has massive ramifications for her argument, which is less about developing an account of the specificity of trans experience, though it's grounded in and theorizes from those experiences, and more about illuminating the ways in which the most basic assumptions about personhood, embodiment, and gender actually get the process by which we assume a body fundamentally wrong. She starts from the assertion that the meanings that attach to the naked body are not pre-cultural, that nakedness is not merely natural. Instead, she argues that nakedness is a socio-moral phenomenon. Quote, "Without the social phenomenon of being clothed," she writes, "there could be no corresponding social phenomenon of being naked." She goes on to suggest that we understand men, women, boys, and girls within what she calls the folk system of interpersonal spatiality, not as merely biological organisms subsumed within the folk system, but as vestorgs. That's kind of like a day-turned use of cyborg, which are not organisms, but organism artifact complexes, since even without them on, the artifacts, that is clothes, accoutrements, technologies of personhood, the artifacts are necessary to their constitution. Again, in short, personhood is technical. She focuses on the philosophical underpinnings that enable the naturalization of what she refers to as the folk system of interpersonal spatiality. And that's the term that she's actually just giving what we might call like the light side of the colonial modern gender system, or just like gender. For Talia, in her work, it's the folk system of interpersonal spatiality, which I think has radical implications. So, that gives social meaning to binary sex differentiation. What we too casually call sex/gender is, to quote her, a differentiation in types of boundaries and in boundary structures that produce two types of interpersonal objects, male and female, each of which can be distinguished in terms of maturity, boys and girls, men and women. These are major conceptual interventions, even though I know it might sound kind of boring. This is like full philosophy mode for me, so I apologize. I'll be done with it soon. Major conceptual interventions. Instead of sex-gendered subjects, we have interpersonal objects. Instead of biological sex differentiation in a gender binary, both mapped onto and derived from that differentiation, we have two types of age-differentiated boundaries that generate an elaborate system of spatial relations, out of which men, women, boys, and girls emerge as sensible, legible agent objects for others. And it's true on Talia's read, and I think generally, right, in this framework, that certain people emerge as legible much more easily than other people. The corollary, of course, is that this system also expels certain beings from legibility in the conventions of interpersonal relation if they seem to violate its conventions. I appreciate this account because of the primacy it gives relationality and encounter, questions of intimacy and distance, and the role perception, one might say the reading of, objects plays in structuring encounters. It is impossible to understand the forms of oppression that trans people experience without such an account of the spatial dynamics of encounter, let alone the varied responses we cultivate in relation to such dynamics. Dissociation, hyper-awareness, social withdrawal, a fixation on passing as cis or being stealth. These are all key parts of a critical phenomenology of trans experience, and they are generated in relation to the folk system of interpersonal spatiality. More specifically, they are responses to the frequent violations of intimacy within the folk system that trans people experience. In a broad sense, to be trans is to routinely experience being thrown out of intimate dialectic, to experience intimate violation because of a perceived trespass of the logic that undergirds the folk system of interpersonal spatiality. This produces what Talia refers to as intimate hemorrhaging, the sense that, quote, one is exposed to others and can do nothing about it. There is no sense of agential capacity that would require the ability to pull within and to experience self-containment, end quote. An unasked for and unwanted spilling forth of aspects of personhood you had not wanted to disclose, a forcible stripping, an intrusive interrogation, and subsequent judgment. What we are currently experiencing in this country is a federal reinforcement and entrenchment of the operations that produce intimate hemorrhaging. There is the denial of youth care, which places the small number of trans teens able to access gender-affirming care, those with supportive caretakers, access to informed clinicians, insurance coverage, in the position of not disclosing with the knowledge that best case access to the technologies of personhood they desire will be deferred until the age of 18. And also, right, I said age of 18, that was a slip. You all know it's the age of 19, right? And I had in my head, in conversation with a friend of mine recently, this idea that this was just because like the administration wanted to make inroads into university like clinics or something. I don't know what I was thinking. And she was just like, no, it's so they can outlaw adult care. And I was like, oh, you're right, that's so obvious. And it's like really symptomatic of what I'm experiencing in this moment, where I just try to like dial down the panic by thinking, oh, it's gotta be like this very strategic small evil that's happening. And then I keep being reminded that no, the evil's much bigger. So anyway, 19, which opens the door to banning technologies of transition for adults. The executive orders banning gender ideology seek to ensure that any demonstration of affirmation or support on the part of educators is punishable, producing a situation wherein to come out as trans is to come out in an environment where ostensible allies are formally silenced. It is to ensure that the life world of trans youth is experienced as fundamentally hostile, and what's worse than this, it actually just deputizes parents, teachers, etc. Formal barring of trans women from sport intensifies and enshrines a long legacy of invasive stripping, testing, and investigation of women who fail to signify as appropriately feminine in the name of protecting the integrity of women's sports. It doubles down on practices long used against women of color, intersex women, and trans women seeking to compete. The forced cessation of gender marker changes on passports and social security cards forcibly outs trans people at multiple junctures, when seeking employment, while traveling, while attempting to access benefits. It opens the door to detainment, strip searches, intensified harassment. These moves instill fear, truncate one's sense of possibility, limit one's ability to move through the world. I almost said freely, but that's a phantasm. Trans folks have never moved freely through the world. Trans being is always attenuated by the possibility of intimate hemorrhaging. None of this is new, it's just worse. A quick glance at the rhetoric, repurposed from the literature affiliated with TERFism, used in these executive orders, makes clear that the aim is not just to revoke certain rights and protections, but to paint trans people as fundamentally deceptive, threatening, and fraudulent. Threats to American empire, saboteurs of a hallowed white cis hetero way of life, untrustworthy, corrosive, and mutilated. Paisley Curra, in a recent N+1 article, refers to the rhetoric used in this coordinated attack as full-throated, explicit dehumanization. He's right. In the place of personhood, there's a persistent reduction to pernicious transphobic tropes. Personhood, only ever discontinuously and unevenly granted in the first place, is here bracketed, withheld, we might even say outright revoked. What does it mean to say that these regulations, this rhetoric, withholds personhood? I want to return to this idea of technologies of personhood to parse this. If personhood is fundamentally interrelational, not a property or essence, and rely on an ensemble of technologies that we use to shape how we signify in relation, then the most immediate and surefire way to deny personhood is to selectively deny access to those technologies, which are a sort of support or scaffolding that works to include or eject bodies from the operations of an intimate dialectic. Recognizing this provides a bigger view of the institutional regulation of sex gender, of which the regulation of trans and intersex bodies is only a part. The history of medical gatekeeping looks different from this vantage. It comes into view as a kind of regulator valve, controlling influx to stabilize and keep coherent an extant folk system that we've come to call a few different things: heterosexuality, the sex-gender system, the colonial modern gender system. Loosening bureaucracy, opening the gates, this means a destabilization of that system. I remember Susan Stryker giving TSQ over a decade ago the slogan, "We're changing gender." This is what she meant. Those changes shifted senses of possibility, and those senses of the possible are shifting yet again in ways more sinister. In a recent piece in New York Magazine, Tori Peters describes her efforts to escape the first days of the Trump administration. She had started to put down roots in Colombia, buying an apartment, pursuing a pathway towards residency in case she needed to leave the States. Traveling around the country by motorcycle, she has stopped repeatedly at police checkpoints. She hands over her passport again and again, thinking about how it needs to be renewed next year, and how this means, provided the situation stands as it is now, that when it is renewed, she will revert to having an M instead of an F as her gender marker. She writes, "By the last police checkpoint, I began to consider whether anything taken from me so easily was ever mine in the first place. Whether one should pragmatically navigate bureaucratic documentation for reasons of safety but refuse to believe in it, whether denied or especially when granted. My state of being, or anyone else's, isn't really a question of what's in the little blue book. It's everything outside it, the nations and genders of birth that seek to follow wherever we go. I had planned an escape, but there is no escape, except for what we reject in our minds and create with one another." Tori reminds me that bodily autonomy is not a given, always a collective project, and rarely ever fully realized. It is an ideal that shapes a terrain of struggle. The overlapping histories of this struggle are, I think, the material out of which this exhibition is built, which is another way of saying that this space is, maybe, an escape, formed of rejection and creation, a portal. Step into the bathroom, wallpapered by Chris Vargas. You'll see what I mean. This last section is called Binding. And I'm really happy. Where is Joseph Liatella? This work is so good. I'm like, so happy you're here. One of the cruelties that underwrites Western post-Enlightenment understandings of personhood is the myth of possessive individualism. If we are raised under that particular conceptual tyranny, it's quite difficult to acknowledge the basic fact of interdependence and the centrality of communal care work and our linked and ongoing efforts to keep on living. A meaningful conception of bodily autonomy necessarily avows the networked, relational, non-individuated character of autonomy, the technical, ethical, and epistemological scaffolding that make possible any informed decision about one's body. An investment in possessive individualism, the way that investment sediments an understanding of the body as property, works in direct contradiction to an affirmation of bodily autonomy. It necessitates corporeal alienation. Nevertheless, it remains hegemonic. Even in my own relation to the current and imminent disasters and impasses, I find it hard to sidestep a kind of fucked up, rugged individualist prepper mentality, a desire to hoard hormones and protein bars and cans of lentil soup, just in case. I've been wondering about how to effectively dismantle such an investment in both psychic and material dimensions. I've been thinking with the pieces in this show, asking about the lived realities of alienation and dissociation, and about how repair is possible. Which means I've been thinking a lot about binding. To think about binding, about being bound, is about learning to see and dignify connection, shared stakes, and fates. It's a necessary step towards ethical and political accountability. As anyone who's ever used a binder knows, it's not without a certain degree of discomfort. Take Joseph Liatella's hemp-yoked volumes of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 4, and On Being an Idea. In this piece, Liatella clusters the thick volumes sometimes referred to as Psychiatry's Bible, roughly 1,000 pages covering all known mental disorders, in groups of 2, 3, 5, and 6. He binds them with a variety of gorgeous and complex wraps and knots. Weighty, dense, carefully and elaborately tied together, they rest, unable to be easily opened, on a white platform underlit by saturated bright red LED lights. The pages of the DSM, key to the history of pathologizing transsubjectivities and gatekeeping access to transition-related technologies, stay closed, sealed, fall into obsolescence as if they'd been impacted by a charm to ward off their stigmatizing power. The piece dramatizes a gathering and containment of the logic of disorder, but graces this containment, a kind of metonym for the many subjects bound together through the diagnostic work of the DSM, with a beautiful binding. To be tied together is constraining, yes, but it's not without its pleasures, not without its simultaneous enablements. The subtitle of On Being an Idea is The Right to Live Without Permission, which is a fragment taken from a statement by the Barcelona-based group Guerrilla Traveloka, which spawned another group called Transblock, whose politics were deeply inflected by anti-psychiatry, depathologization, and the demand for bodily autonomy. It's likely that Liatella encountered this quote in Preciado's Testo Junkie, where it appears beneath quotes from Donna Haraway and Kate Bornstein, the third epigraph to a section titled The Micropolitics of Gender in the Pharmacopornographic Era, Experimentation, Voluntary Intoxication, and Mutation. And this is my desk. And some of the weird shit, I'll talk about this in a second, that I'm reading as part of a project on Reed Erickson, the millionaire transsexual. I'll get to that. But, okay. Liatella quoted the longer statement in a post about the show on Instagram. So I've been on your Instagram, and I was like, this is very helpful context. And I want to reproduce that quote here to put the work in a larger context. We champion uncertainty, believe in the possibility of looking back as if it were a step forward. We think that no process of construction should be imposed as irreversible. We want to make the beauty of androgyny visible. We believe in our right to get rid of our bandages to be able to breathe, or to never remove them, and our right to be operated on by good surgeons, and free access to hormonal treatments without having to resort to psychiatric permission forms, and our right to self-medicate with hormones. We demand the right to live without getting anyone's permission. The version of the DSM in Liatella's piece was the last to contain an entry for gender identity disorder. The DSM-5 replaced this diagnosis with that of gender dysphoria, eliminating the stigmatizing language of disorder and instead focusing on felt distress, a move that was widely heralded as an end to pathologizing understandings of transness. Whether it actually was is a different question. But here, I want to highlight the collective's emphasis on self-determination, the rejection of teleologies of transition, and their call for a kind of historically transversal understanding of trans embodiment, which necessitates a profoundly ethical embrace of uncertainty and, as they say, a belief in the possibility of looking back as if it were a step forward. Lately, I have very much been looking back as if it were a way forward. I have been burrowing through bankers' boxes full of ephemera, loose scribbles, legal files. I've been thinking about what it means to live with and through a diagnosis of disorder, and how so many people took a pragmatic approach to such a diagnosis, never understanding it as coterminous with whatever their self was, understanding it as a means to an end, bracketing it as a way of saying that their state of being wasn't contained by the language of diagnosis or the sense that institutions made of them. We're amid a moment wherein the current administration seems to believe that if they simply keep repeating the biological sex as binary and immutable, that will somehow make it true. The wrong-headed and simply wrong insistence on binary and immutable sex is paired with a total jettisoning of gender, the concept that gave salience to gender identity disorder in the first place, a concept deployed within mid-20th century sexology to name one among several variables of sex differentiation, variables which were not binary to begin with, which admitted admixture, degrees of consonance and dissonance in relation to polarities of sex differentiation. The concept of gender built on research into the etiology and presentation of various intersex conditions, proof themselves of the resolutely non-binary and very much mutable dynamics of biological sex differentiation. It had to do with one's felt sense of belonging to a sex and came to include signifying acts that disclose that sense of belonging and later dissonance and disidentification with a sense of belonging to any category within what Talia calls the folk system of interpersonal spatiality, men and women, boys and girls. But amid the flourishing usage of gender-related terms, gender identity, core gender identity/role, there were discontents. I mean, of course there were. I become increasingly obsessed with trans dissent in this moment of consolidating medico-scientific authority, particularly as it clustered around the question of etiology. If gender was a felt sense of belonging, or not, to a sex, where did this felt sense of belonging come from? Infamously, sexologist, or as he preferred, sexosopher, John Money, claimed it was a product of socialization, roughly sedimented by age 2. How dry, how fixed, how bafflingly non-agentic. To think that the psychic and material life of gender is hardwired around the time you started chatting with the world around you. To think that any further experimentations and adventures are irrevocably shaped and constrained by whatever happened to have happened in that brief temporal container, a kind of black box full of events simultaneously irretrievable, ineffable, and enduring, just sucks. I struggled with how to finish that sentence. And that was what I decided on. Part of demanding the right to live without permission is insisting that the story doesn't end at the age of 2, refusing the notion that the rest of life is mere accommodation to an already inscribed identitarian truth, and the companionate idea that the job of a clinician is to reveal and assess that truth, to ascertain its reality status. For some of us, the why of how we are might be a bandage we live with, content to leave intact what it shrouds, out of sight, out of mind. For others, it might be one we remove to try and suss out the state of what's underneath. This might mean we find ourselves, maybe quite suddenly, in the domain of the metaphysical. A few years ago, my mother died of cancer. While she was sick, we were talking about bodies. A firm believer in reincarnation, she was getting ready to leave hers behind, to transition into whatever was next. She asked me about how I felt in my body, post-transition. I shrugged. It's epiphenomenal, just the vessel I happen to be in. My body, a rented and renovated space, a little more livable now. Did I believe this? I said it casually, easily. My mother nodded, said, "That's what I think too." What's a gender in the face of death? It deeply shapes the terms of your living and your dying, but you can't take it with you. Or can you? After she died, I took a ferry to Vancouver Island to spend time at the transgender archives at the University of Victoria. I was lured there by the 48 boxes that comprise the archive of Reed Erickson, born 1917, died 1992, engineer, millionaire, philanthropist, transsexual. I know there are some Erickson fans in here. Looking at, yeah. So yeah, this is a little bit about our problematic fave. I became rapidly obsessed and have spent many weeks with his archives over the past 3 years. I've learned about his extensive experimentation with drugs, psychotropic and non, his long-term relationship with ketamine, his ashrams, his belief in past life regression, his desire to open an institute for advanced metaphysical studies, his publication of New Age philosophy, his understanding that under the right conditions, which typically involved ketamine, he could receive communications directly from God, and I think you can see some of the echoes of this in the Schreiber piece and also in the Schreiber memoirs, so yeah. After encountering all this, I would add aspiring mystic to any list of nouns used in conjunction with his name. I wonder even about using the modifier aspiring. Who am I to judge? I'm in the William James camp. When it comes to mystical states, and this is a quote from James's Varieties of Religious Experience, my own constitution shuts me out from their enjoyment almost entirely. And I can speak of them only at secondhand. I was talking with Susan Stryker about Erickson a few months ago. She, a formidable historian, has probably the most prodigious grasp of the nexus of sexology, transactivism, Cold War politics, New Age philosophy, and psychotropic drug use that shaped his milieu during the last 30 or so years of his life, most of which he lived between Ojai and Mazatlan. She gave me a long list of recommended reading. She also told me that an ex of his once described him as so credulous his brain was liable to fall out of his head. My brain, on the other hand, is pretty definitely locked in, at least for now, unfortunately. His credulity offers lessons, though, especially to my skeptical, paranoid ass. If your social world is anything like mine, you've been inundated with assertions that the state can't change who you are. It can make your life difficult, but it can't make you any less trans. As the old saws go, trans people exist, we've always been here, and so on. Fine, I think. I understand the sentiment, the rhetorical sway, even the historical logic. I think there are other, more exigent questions that these assertions leave unaddressed that have to do with material considerations, questions of survival and livability, resource access. Knowing that you're trans isn't the problem. The evisceration of the epistemological, social, and political scaffolding that might support that existence is. From that vantage, the palliative impact of such assertions is, let's say, limited at best. I'm more and more sympathetic to Reid's take. This is a man who, for much of his adult life, was occupied with the task of expanding what we might now call resource access for trans people. He partially bankrolled much of mid-20th century trans medicine and started an organization, the Erickson Educational Foundation, that laid the groundwork for the legitimation of trans medicine. After aiding the formation of the organization that would become the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, he felt secure in handing the baton to a growing group of medical and therapeutic professionals committed to providing access, albeit limited, to hormonal and surgical transition. He is most certainly rolling over in his grave right now. In the late 1970s, he turned his attention elsewhere. He bought a mansion a few miles from here. This is the Google Street View. In Country Club Park, to house an Institute for Advanced Metaphysical Studies. It was to be, this is actually the mansion. You cannot see it from the street. I have tried. You have to peek in through the gate or hope you can follow a landscaping crew in. All right. So this Institute for Advanced Metaphysical Studies was to be dedicated to the study of self-integrity, metaphysics, and metamedicine, or shamanism. These are Erickson's words. For very dramatic and complicated reasons I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, the Institute never came to fruition. Nevertheless, it is a dramatic signal of his turn towards mysticism. He started planning a conference on the therapeutic uses of ketamine to be held at Esalen, the institute that has long operated as a kind of ground zero for the human potential movement. He titled this conference The Keys to the Kingdom, and he meant the Kingdom of God. He called ketamine colloquially Key K, because he thought it was one way to open the door to that kingdom. This, too, never came to fruition, again, for very complicated and dramatic reasons that also involved ketamine, and cocaine, and evading drug charges, and fleeing to Mexico, which I'm also happy to talk about in the Q&A. Here he is in 1975, writing a note to Zelda Suppley, the woman who helped him run the Erickson Educational Foundation, for a book on transsexuality in the New Age that also never came to fruition. In the archives, it's sandwiched in between a reminder to send his friend Marcia a caftan and a list of vinyl records, all classical, that he wants to have replaced. He writes, "The incidence of transsexuals is just another illustration of how stupid humans are in trying to set up a limited number of categories for the infinitude of God's kingdom. There is no such thing as male and a female. Any definition of maleness or femaleness would have to be arbitrary. Recognize it as such, and don't expect nature or people's natures to take heed of human divisions." He goes on, "You are you. If another finds this unsatisfactory, that is his or her problem, not yours, even though there are those who try to make it seem so, including society, doctors, psychiatrists, parents, etc. But all of those wise men speak through ignorance of divine law, and ignorance of your personal integrity." For Reid, to be trans is to be in possession of a form of self-knowing that is fundamentally at odds with and necessarily distrustful of both institutional authority and any taxonomical logic on offer. He doesn't search for an etiology. He's not concerned with why he is the way he is, but he's convinced that it's a question that extant and future sciences will be unable to answer. Human categories and their modes of inhabitance, what Talia would call the folk system of interpersonal spatiality, are limited, arbitrary. Reid says they're stupid. I feel that. They're heavy-handed reductions of the manifold complexities of being enfleshed in this world. Reed says, what humans term sex or gender is just an assortment of polarities, some of which are visible, but the polarities are many and transdimensional, and in the main, invisible. He uses scare quotes around visible and invisible. I wish he were around so I could ask him why. I suspect he would like this show, the way that certain modes of scientific knowledge of sex gender are rendered transparent. I'm thinking of Dean Erdman's translucent reproductions of books from Hirschfeld's library, burnt by fascists, where the historical weight comes to matter more than the words. He'd appreciate the careful attention to more opaque dimensions of enfleshed experience, like Palomar's visual translation of the visions of gender transformation experienced by Schreber. It is possible, Erikson seems to say, to see the unseen, to unsay the said. This is how we might become attuned to a beyond of positivism. I see this too, and say it with him. Thanks.
Thank you for this. I wanted to ask about how being a paranoiac changes your relationship to care. Being a paranoid what? Changes your relationship to care.
Ooh. Yeah. All right. Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. And I actually think that, okay, so like the long way around this. I started writing this, and then I immediately thought of the Cedric essay, and I thought of paranoid and reparative reading. And I'd really always thought, like, I'm really a good reparative reader when I write. Like, I'm like doing the job of reparative reading well. And then I was like, maybe that's true, but when I think about the world and the future, I'm extremely paranoid. And I actually think that that paranoia is one of the fundamental motivators to engage in acts of care, right? At the everyday level. Making sure people have what they need in case things fall apart rapidly, right? But it's also, I mean, it's psychologically incredibly stressful. And it's also really difficult to be in intimate spaces and in political collectives and doing any kind of political work with folks who are similarly paranoid and similarly panicked, right? Where the intensity is just ramped up. So I don't know if like folks have been encountering calls to start stockpiling. Like, of course you have your go bag in case you need to flee to some other similarly fascist country. But then it's also like, you know, have enough in case the grid fails, you need to have X, Y, and Z in place. And there's a way in which sort of being really, like it feels really pragmatic to do that work, to be like, all right, well, in case of the apocalypse, I'm gonna make sure that our basement is stocked with goods and that we can make soup for our family. But it also, when you live in that place for days and weeks and months and years on end, it's really hard to even remember what it is to encounter the world reparatively, I think. And it's something I've struggled with for a long time. And I think that it's something that anybody who is doing sort of collective care work for multiply marginalized people in situations that are worsening, right, probably understands pretty intimately. So I don't know if I answered, but this is a great question and something I want to think a lot more about, because it's like, paranoia does some things really well, like Cedric says, right? I mean, it does. But it's also a really hard place to live.
Can you tell us all the drama about Reed that you alluded to?
Where is that coming from?
Hi.
I don't know if I can tell you all the drama about Reed. But I will say that Cam Cannon is writing about Reed Erikson, and Chris Vargas knows a lot about Reed Erikson too, so they can probably fill you in on some of the drama that I miss. But the one thing that I've been writing a lot about is Erikson's relationship with One Incorporated, the homophile organization. That was the organization that eventually led to the creation of the One Archives, which are just a few miles from here. And in the mansion right? So the Millbank mansion that I pictured is a mansion that Erickson bought. I think today it would probably list for like 6.5, maybe 7 million. Erickson bought it for about a little over $1 million. In the early 1980s, he bought it from a millenarian cult because they were about to sell their properties in Southern California and move to Montana to prepare for the apocalypse, which was a product of like Cold War, nuclear power. Yeah, that's another story. But anyway, he bought it from this cult, and the cult members were homophobic, so they had to disguise the fact that the property was going to be partially used for this Institute for Advanced Metaphysical Studies, and also partially for the one Institute for Homophile Studies. One was already operating graduate level courses in homophile studies, and they wanted like a better space, and Erickson had been bankrolling one since the early 1960s and was like, well, I'll help you buy a space, and I also want to use your accreditation to do my New Age metaphysics stuff too. And the guys, and they were all guys, with one were like, cool, we'll take your money, but we don't know about the metaphysics. So they started arguing about the property, and it's a little hearsay. I haven't verified it. I don't know how I would verify it, but Susan Stryker told me that the main person in dispute with Erickson around this property was one of the co-founders of One. His name was Doyle. And Susan says that she suspects that Doyle staged a drug bust to Erickson's property in Ojai to get him arrested, so it would make it easier for One, Doyle, and One to take over the full property, the full mansion, from Erickson. And that ended up actually being the case because Erickson, in order to evade the drug charges, fled to Mexico to his ashram in Mazatlan, the Lovejoy Palace, and didn't come back into the States. So there was a legal battle that drug on for about 10 years around the property. Oh, I missed a detail. See, it's like, it spirals. There's a lot of rabbit holes. Because the millenarian cult was homophobic, Erickson had to buy the property not for One and the Institute for Advanced Metaphysical Studies, but just under his personal name. So he bought it just as Reed Erickson, and he wrote letters to the head of the millenarian cult saying, like, I was raised with connections to Christian Science, and I understand what you all are about, and I too, like, believe that a new era is coming and we have to prepare for it. So he like really soft-shoed his way around the sale of this property, got them to agree to it, and buried the fact that there were going to be like basically proto-queer studies classes happening on the property. But then that all fell apart because the folks with One really had no intention of letting him do his New Age stuff, even though he had paid for the property. Messy. But the drug bust in Ojai. So Susan Stryker says that Doyle set Erickson up and like had the Ventura County Sheriff's Department come to the house in Ojai to bust him. And the Ventura County Star Free Press, I think, whatever the paper of record there was in the news report about the drug bust, it claims that Erickson called the police himself because he was concerned about people prowling around the perimeter of his like very private country club property. And that when the police arrived, he invited them into his house where they saw a bunch of ketamine and cocaine. And then they said, well, we have to search your premises because we see all this ketamine and cocaine laying around. They went into his bathroom. It was basically like being used as an impromptu lab. And they were like, what's happening in there? And he was like, well, I'm a medical researcher. I'm experimenting on myself with ketamine. And they were like, cool, but this isn't a lab. This is your bathroom. So anyway, that's some of the drama around the ketamine bust. He fled to Mexico, legal dispute over the Millbank mansion for about a decade, a little over a decade. And the way the property was finally divided, more than half of it went to the folks involved, Doyle and the folks involved with One Incorporated, and it housed their archives, which became the sort of seed archives for the One archives at USC, where they eventually moved from the Millbank mansion. Wild-ass story. There's also another component of the story that led to the formation of the transgender archives at the University of Victoria. These two archives, the One archives and the transgender archives, are just the product of a historic beef between an old, kind of mean homophile activist and Reed Erickson. Yeah. Anyway. Sorry. That was long. It could be longer.
Thank you so much for that talk. I had a question. I'm thinking about the tension that you named between these more kind of abstract ideas of transness as like an ahistorical reality, and then questions of material access to care and the restriction of that access. And I'm thinking about that in light of the last quote from Erickson that you shared, about the kind of stupidity of these categories. But I'm also thinking about how Erickson did have regular legal access to care that he could afford, at least for the last several decades of his life. So I'm just wondering if what thoughts you have about that tension, and also if you found anywhere in the archive where Erickson talked about what if he couldn't access these things, or what if there was a more kind of thorough restriction?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Erickson received, it's like important historical note, Erickson received access to hormones and surgery via Harry Benjamin, and he partially funded Harry Benjamin, who's like a well-known sexologist, sort of architect of trans medicine, partially funded his medical practice after Benjamin moved to New York. And so he had access to trans-affirming surgery or gender-affirming surgery long before most people did, right? A really early moment in the 60s, which was a point when Erickson was already middle-aged, it's important to note. And Erickson was wealthy, came from oil money, basically, money from extractive industry, and was basically able to pay for that access, but also paid for it by bankrolling trans medical practitioners and sexologists in the mid-century who were not always nice to him and kind of said lots of really shitty things behind his back, which Kim and I spent a lot of time talking about earlier today. So they kind of exploited Erickson, but it meant Erickson had access to care, and he was one of the few people who could afford that access in that moment. And then he spent a solid decade and a half via the Erickson Educational Foundation trying to expand access. And part of what undergirded his mission to expand access was an investment in the human potential movement, or what we now refer to as the New Age movement. So he really believed that like the goal of existing in this form on Earth was to realize your full potential. And he understood gender transition to be a part of that. And he wanted that to be accessible to as many people as possible. And he understood it, from my reading, right? He understood it as like part of his life's calling to do that work. So he had this underlying metaphysical commitment involving self-actualization so one could like ascend in the afterlife that informed his relationship to trans medicine. And I think that that's really, knowing that places that work in a different kind of context for me. So it's like, yes, there was this material and sort of practical component to it, but it was all about supporting people in self-actualization. And he was reading all of the big 60s and 70s psychological texts about that. Like, there are notes where he's like, recommended reading after pieces like this, and it's like the Bible and Rollo May. So, yeah. I didn't answer the question fully.
No, that's perfect.
But
yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was beautiful and so anecdotal, which is very much welcome. I'm really struck by a question you posed. What does it mean for these regulations, these administrative regulations, to withhold personhood? And you shared Tori Peters' story in which she writes that she planned an escape, but there is no escape. And so I'm thinking of a trans fugitivity, potentially, right? A perpetual pursuit of escape with no promise of destination, what Rizvana Bradley may refer to as a non-arriving fugitivity. And I'm thinking about how this condition of trans escape, or the impossibility of it, is linked to notions of possessive individualism that you also discussed, the myth of possessive individualism and the inhibition of personhood. And so I'm wondering, how may transness as category and as ontology potentially fall apart via this myth of possessive individualism and potentially a trans impulse such as mine to evade personhood or disavow subjectivity and identitarian politics altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder about that too. I don't know if I have a direct answer to it. I think that one of the reasons that I spent so long with Talia's book is because I think that Talia really made vivid to me the point that it doesn't really matter in the context of what she calls the folk system of interpersonal spatiality what our investments or rejections are, right? Like, it doesn't matter what my read on subjectivity or identity is when I'm going through airport security. In that moment, I am an object, right? I'm an object in relationship to the state apparatus. I'm an object in relationship to the security, right, technologies. And it's pretty vividly the case going through airport security, but it's also the case in the context of everyday interaction, right? So I could have, and I do, I think, have a strong critique of possessive individualism, of overinvestment in identity politics, of, right, the proliferation of sort of hyper-specialized subjectivities is a mode of political resistance. Like, I have that critique. I think I share that critique. But me having that critique doesn't really matter when I'm walking down the street or ordering food or trying to access healthcare. And I think that bit at the end of the Peter stuff that I quoted, where she's having this realization, and it feels in the writing like it's a realization she's had to have over and over and over again. Like, oh yeah, no, I probably overinvested in my passport documentation, right? I overinvested in this letter that can be so easily withheld, right, when the state decides to withhold it. So then the question becomes, like, how many times do we have to relearn this lesson? And is it possible to not overinvest in that way? Right? Like, is it possible to be like, I don't really care what whether an M or an F is on my passport? People are going to have different answers to that. But I think it's an important question to keep asking.
Hi, thanks so much. I guess hearing you speak about how you've been feeling in the last period has me thinking about, I guess, just the ways that I've sought and or found clarity and groundedness, sometimes and been surprised by it, actually, and amidst a lot of chaos. And one of the things that struck me has been the surprising places it comes from sometimes. And if I can just like share anecdotally really quickly, like one of those places that I've been grateful for is actually also the most trans antagonistic person in my family, who's my stepfather, who made my like medical transition kind of difficult, but who also, for some reason, in the last couple of weeks, I think, been thinking about all of his lessons, because he was somebody who was in San Quentin, who's a survivor of the California prison system, who was, in so many ways, my childhood was sort of shaped by him trying to teach me the lessons of how to survive prison, the streets, even though I'm so fortunate the conditions I lived under were not that, right? That he had given us a different kind of life. And until recently, I always sort of felt like it was overkill. I'm like, did he really have to time our showers? Or did he really have to do whatever he was doing, And yeah, like maybe. And like definitely, like this is an unhealed person in my life. But like, there's something, I don't know, I guess I just share that because I am curious for you, and also just for other, for other folks, like, sort of like, what are the unexpected, surprising places that you're finding that you've learned the things that you already needed to survive, or like where are you finding these things that are maybe not where you would have expected? And you know, I feel like I'm picking up maybe strands or intuitions about that in this talk. So I just wonder if you could speak about that a little bit more. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, but one of them has been, this is similarly, right, personal. My younger brother was addicted to heroin and unhoused in Miami for about 12 years. And he lives close to me, and he's got 2 kids. And, you know, I'm sort of like grandparent, uncle combined because both of our parents are deceased. And what's funny is my little brother doesn't really have any investment in trans politics at all. And I don't know, he thinks he thinks Trump is a maniac, but he's not really invested in the state at all either. But what's interesting is when he sees me panic about all of the executive orders and all of the, you know, everything that's happening right now, he's one of the only people that knows how to like downregulate me, because I think he's had to learn how to do that both with himself and with other folks over the years that he was unhoused. And there's a kind of like, I don't know if it's pragmatism, I don't know what it is, but not somebody that would paint himself as a trans ally, but he's somebody who knows how to operate in crisis really well. And yeah, so that's been an unexpected source of like security and comfort in my life. And maybe there are important lessons about solidarity, right, there too. I think there are. But that's something important to think about. There's also like this move, think about like, well, what's positive right now that I'm like, oh, this is what I'm saying I'm so bad at. this is the thing that I'm finding really difficult. And part of what I'm struggling with is being okay with that, you know? And not being like, where's the trans joy in this situation? Sometimes you just don't got it, and that's fine.
Yeah, I don't want to ask you to force it, you know, no, definitely not. Yeah, thank you.
Hello? I think I'm having the trans mask mic problem. Let me talk.
I saw you have it earlier. I was like,
yeah.
I know about that.
Thank you for that talk. It was amazing. I think I love this sort of synthesis that's happening between these sort of like spiritual questions of like the why when we talk about like both Rita Erickson, but also like what can be given and taken away and what is actually eternal. And I'm thinking also a lot about like when we talk about what can be given and taken away. I'm curious your thoughts on who gets to actually define personhood and humanhood, you know, and like how being able to revoke one's personhood, if someone can define that, which I personally don't believe they can, requires a sort of level of dehumanization, not just to the other person, but like a condition of internally to not actually be in touch with one's own humanity. So I guess I'm curious about like this intersection of these deeper sort of spiritual questions, both of what can be given and taken away, and also how you see that and also with Cecilia, you know, she was such a anything it takes kind of lady, you know, had such a vibrant positivity despite facing conditions I personally cannot imagine. And so I guess this is sort of not necessarily the most, you know, formed question, but I'm just thinking about how all those things intersect and her having that interaction being like, no, I'm going to get it myself. Like, I won't take it from you because you'll say you can take it away from me, but I'm going to get it myself. And I think I'm just curious about like what your thoughts are in that time, because I think a lot of us are being asked to think about how we're going to get it for each other and get it for ourselves right now.
I mean, I think that's a great question. And that refrain in the paper that is from Talia's work about personhood being technical, I think is the way that I've been trying to think about that, right? So if personhood is not a property in essence, if it is in fact something that's supported relationally, right? It's not necessarily bestowed either, but it's supported relationally or it's not. And it can be supported robustly or it can be supported very minimally or really not at all. Then the question becomes, how do we create support structures that make personhood possible when part of the craftiness of the conservative playbook is that they seem to understand very well the fact that personhood is enabled by all of these material supports, and they've targeted the material supports, not used rhetoric to refuse the personhood, right? They're actually very deliberate about not using rhetoric that says trans people aren't people. They say everything but that, but it's very clear that that's what they think, right? But how, so then it's like, okay, well, you can think about like mutual aid and communal care, and how do we create these support structures for one another that make the technicality of personhood possible in relation. And it's like, I think that's crucial, and I think it's important work to do. But I also am trying to be practical about its limits, right? I mean, there's only so much that mutual aid, it can only work so far as a stopgap. And at some point, I've been wondering, like, when does an investment in mutual aid actually just continue to enable state dispossession? That's a tough question, right? So, but it makes the refrain of like, well, the solution is mutual aid and collective care. That's become too easy in my thinking, right? It's like, it's important, but I think there's a horizon beyond that, and there are demands beyond that.
Yeah, and I think that they understand, they meaning like the right, which is also in some, is kind of like a divine law, quote unquote, is like an idea shared makes it more powerful. And I think like using that could be very beneficial to where we are now. Yeah.
Okay, I've got it. Took me a second. I just want to thank the people in the audience your questions have been really amazing, and we're hoping we're continuing this conversation through the weekend, and it's like we've been feeling really hungry for it. This exchange between you two of you just is like there's a couple things I've been thinking about. One is just like some of the deep, challenging kind of work in Black feminist theory sits in that space of like where there's like this mechanism that strips personhood, but at the root of it is also this like desire, like this kind of cannibalistic attachment, right? So that there's like a kind of fascination, desire, hatred, like that those things are all entangled with each other, right? And that's so much of what we're seeing and so many different like registers. And I think it's one of the harder things in the shows is like trying to work across these different registers of that interlacing of like, it's like interest, desire, hate, like the way those things come together. And then the mutual aid question, you made me think about, it's a philosopher, Howard Cagel's book. I've forgotten the name of it, but it's like Philosophies of Resistance. And it's a take on a book about war. He's like, it's a theorization of war, where he talks about how like in a warlike position, the agent that's conducting the war, the enemy, like the aim is to eliminate the enemy's capacity to resist, right? And so like that resisting within the context of a war is about sustaining your capacity to resist. And then each chapter of the book looks at these different kinds of case studies of resistance movements within a context of a war. And so you're making me think about that, because it's like, I do think mutual aid is about sustaining the capacity to resist. And it may not feel like enough, but in a warlike environment, which is not about like state management, right? And just like the kind of biopolitics of like managing a population, but about eliminating the population, right? Like that sustaining the capacity to resist is itself like really important, right? So this is where you kind of brought me. Sorry, it's like I'm so dark, but that's the
I mean, it is dark.
yeah, it
It's
is the
dark.
heyday for transsexual paranoiacs. Is that yeah? I think I'm also like grabbing the mic in order to put a pause on the conversation so that we can shift into whatever libations and restorative mutual aid we need to provide to each other this evening. In the hopes that people will be restored to return to the museum tomorrow afternoon for the artist panels that we have. We have Panteha Abareshi, Peace Staff, Oliver Husain and Kerstin Schroedinger who are here, and with Nicki Green. So it's a very, it's a day tomorrow in which we'll be thinking about all of these things through the practices of these incredible artists. So I hope I see some of you tomorrow, and thank you everyone. I'll stand up. Thank you everybody for coming out. Jeanne, it was really special. Thank you, Hil.